whenever I talk about renewable energy, I'm reminded of Mark Twain's line where he said it's easier to fool people than to convince them they've been fooled. Hopefully this morning I will not have to do much of the latter. The packet that you have in front of you is my presentation from a couple weeks ago. I have made some changes since then, so it'll probably be best to focus mainly on my slides on the screen. The IICC is a bipartisan renewable energy citizens watchdog group. We're in Blissfield, Michigan, Representative Jenkins' district. We're about 40% Democratic, 60% Republican. They range from self-identified liberal environmentalists to free market libertarians. Many of our supporters live in the front lines of industrial wind development. We seek energy policy that is affordable, reliable, socially and environmentally responsible. As we were left off a couple weeks ago, of course, the first insurmountable hurdle that PA 295 has is that it's unconstitutional. It's in-state generation mandate. I read to you Posner's dicta last time, and even the Clean Energy States Alliance says even a state's interest in environmental health, diverse supply, safety, and energy conservation may not save facially discriminatory state RPS or renewable incentive laws. That's a profound hurdle. The result is that PA 295 is currently depriving Michigan utilities, cooperatives, and thus ratepayers of their constitutional right to acquire renewable energy from the lowest cost provider anywhere in the U.S. Yet without the ability to mandate in-state generation, even more doubt is cast upon already dubious green jobs claims. And I don't need to remind you of the headline that came out in the Journal last week. The second hurdle is we hear wind promoters basically prescribe one-size-fits-all renewable energy mandates, but they fail to take into consideration the drastic difference in wind resources available even inside MISO. Iowa, for instance, has large regions of 8.5 meter per second wind potential. Michigan has none, even at 100 meters. Iowa will produce roughly 2 times the energy from each turbine as Michigan, a permanent 2-to-1 price disadvantage for Michigan. I heard former Senator Patty Burkholz 2 weeks ago say that we're losing the wind race. Well, I can run and so can Usain Bolt, but I would tell you not to bet the taxpayers' money on me coming in first place. I lack the resources to outrun Usain Bolt. Likewise, Michigan cannot compete with Prairie State's wind and cost. Nowhere close. And you don't have to trust me, of course. NREL says PPA prices are generally low in the U.S. interior, like Iowa, high in the west, and in the middle of the Great Lakes and northeast regions. The large interior region where much of U.S. wind project development occurs saw average levelized PPA prices of just over $30 in 2011 and 2012. Michigan's average PPA price is $80. And even in a state like Iowa, with in 2010 16% wind, their CO2 from coal generation, according to EIA, is still rising. Iowa's wind is almost entirely exported to fulfill out-of-state RPS mandates. Although Michigan is now obligated to pay for new transmission across MISO, Michigan utilities cannot currently buy cheap Iowa wind and apply it to our mandate. Next hurdle is that the installed cost of wind generation in Michigan is quite high. We run, according to MPSC, 22 to 25.50 a kilowatt. Iowa's latest example is $16.50. Even free wind fuel cannot overcome this hurdle. The result, a $30 megawatt per megawatt hour Iowa wind PPA would be a cost savings of more than 60% relative to Michigan's average wind price of $80 and far cheaper than even Michigan's current lowest price in-state wind PPA of $49. In fact, Michigan fixed price wind PPAs are expensive even at peak MISO pricing of $75 to $80. Question was asked by Representative Lamonti, I think 2 weeks ago, about subsidies. I brought a couple slides that talk about the relative subsidies between various forms of generation. In 2007, you see that wind received $23.37 per megawatt hour in subsidies, while coal and gas were well below $1, and nuclear was just over $1. Now, under the Obama stimulus package, that changed drastically. We see that wind received almost $53 per megawatt hour in subsidies. Wind, unlike thermal generation, is almost fully dependent upon federal tax breaks. We know that's true because essentially no wind has been built in the U.S. in the first 6 months of this year because the production tax credit was in doubt and was only renewed at the last minute in 2012. And in total subsidies in 2010, wind received more total subsidies than all other forms of generation combined. There's a huge upside risk to ratepayers here. That federal PTC is roughly equivalent to the wholesale grid price for electricity. Michigan wind is already at a price disadvantage. As wind generation is pushed into less desirable regions, costs of generation and transmission will continue to rise. Now, the Michigan Environmental Council talks a lot about these 9 dirty coal plants. There's about 5,000 megawatts of capacity. Let's say, for argument's sake, that I agree with them and we need to close all 9 immediately due to the health effects. We only have 4 practical options. We can replace those 9 plants with 5,000 megawatts of nuclear. We can replace them with combined cycle gas turbines. We can replace them with 5,000 megawatts of advanced coal with carbon capture and sequestration. Or we can add wind to that 5,000 megawatts of combined cycle gas generation. You may say, why not wind plus storage, which is something you'll hear environmental advocates talk about quite a bit. With our measured 2013 25% wind capacity factor, we would have to build 20,000 megawatts of new wind generation plus massive pumped hydro short-term storage, yet that would still not obviate the need for a 5,000 megawatt combined cycle gas turbine plant. The levelized cost of energy of 3x wind plus storage plus CCGT is well beyond $200 a megawatt hour and would cost more than $70 billion to construct. But we lack suitable land area, and it would take decades to permit and construct, and no one is seriously proposing to do so. That is why, and this is a critical point, Michigan's wind generation is bound to fossil fuel. Fossil fuel is wind generation's de facto storage in the state of Michigan. We lack ample hydro resources. WEA board member Eon Energy explains, wind is able to replace traditional power stations only to a limited extent. Traditional power stations with capacities equal to 90% of the installed wind capacity must be permanently online in order to guarantee power supply at all times. There's no such thing as wind generation by itself. Non-dispatchable intermittent resources simply cannot directly replace dispatchable resources. This has serious policy implications. Here's a real-world example. Consumers Energy's asked for approval of their 750 megawatt Thetford gas plant. Despite us already having spent several $1 billion on wind, we're still asked to create new dispatchable generation capacity. Now, I've introduced a couple news slides here. I wasn't familiar with this group until about a month and a half ago, but MISO, our regional transmission operator, has an independent market monitor. In this case, it's Potomac Economics. And they oversee MISO's policy, and they watch their data, and they look for risks to the stability of the system and to people participating in the market. And you can see the quote at the bottom, as the independent market monitor, Potomac Economics receives data continuously that is used to evaluate the performance of the markets and identify conduct by market participants or the Midwest ISO that compromise the efficiency or distort the outcome of the markets. This June, they released a report on MISO. Potomac reported in June that MISO is overestimating MISO reserve margin for times of peak demand. MISO reported that they had 28% reserve margin. This is the amount of energy you have available in surplus for times of very high demand to make sure that power gets to things like incubators and factories, etc. Their target reserve margin was 14.2, but they were reporting 28. But the independent market monitor said actually, using their calculations, it's only 18.7, but during hot summers, perhaps as low as 6.9%. Reserve margin is at risk in MISO despite billions of wind generation being constructed. Reserve margins can generally only be improved by adding new dispatchable generation like fossil or nuke. So despite billions in wind, MISO is reserve margin constrained. Wind energy does not add firm capacity and cannot replace fossil fuel plants. Again, the IMN said wind is strongly negatively correlated with load, which means that wind is often the lowest during peak periods when it is needed most. This presents challenges for developing an appropriate capacity credit for wind. Again, wind does not add firm capacity. Again, IMM, this methodology would produce an average capacity credit for wind of 2.7% for 2013 and 2014. We recommend that MISO consider this as an alternative for granting credits. MISO was reporting that wind had a capacity value of about 13 or 14%, but the IMN says no, it's only 2.7, which for all practical purposes is zero. That's because wind does not add firm capacity and cannot replace fossil fuel plants. The truth about wind generation is it's simply a fuel-saving accessory one can add to existing fossil generation. It is not a replacement for fossil generation plants. No matter the current price of wind energy contracts, wind is only replacing some of the fuel cost for fossil generating plants and not the plants themselves. So $49 to $108 Michigan wind are saving $25 to $35 worth of fossil fuel, that is all. Fourth hurdle. PA 295, and this boggles my mind. Despite the declared purpose of PA 295 to create clean air, there is no requirement to empirically measure air quality improvements directly attributable to the Act, nor perform comparative cost-benefit analysis. Ratepayers and regulators cannot assess whether or not the Act has been successful in its ostensible purpose. And here's what we know. Replacing coal generation with combined cycle gas, for example, reduces CO2 emissions at a cost of about 30 bucks a ton. Adding unsubsidized wind to CCGT incrementally reduces some additional CO2, but at a cost of $300 a ton. For every dollar spent on wind, 10 times more reductions could be achieved by building combined cycle gas turbines alone. Next, this one has bothered us for a long time. PA 295 requires MPSC to give an annual report showing the comparative levelized cost of energy between wind and new coal. We heard people say this 2 weeks ago. MPSC says wind is cheaper than new coal. It's even cheaper than old coal. However, this erroneously assumes the two modes of generation are interchangeable, but they are not. Levelized cost of energy is if you want to go to a bookshelf and say, okay, I'm retiring a 1,000 megawatt coal plant. What are my options to replace that? Well, gee, wind looks good. Let me pull that off the shelf and plug it in that 1,000 megawatt spot, except it doesn't work because it's not dispatchable. It's not theirs. I heard Irene Dimitri from Detroit Edison say last fall they could sit in the control room and see what wind was giving them in July and August, and her quote was a big fat goose egg. Wind isn't there when you need it most. Thus, Dr. Josko at MIT says, look, the production profiles for intermittent dispatchable generation and the value of the electricity they produce are likely to be very different, making comparisons based on levelized cost alone meaningless. PA 295 has essentially codified a meaningless cost comparison between wind and coal. And here's why. Wind generation is inverse to demand. I'm not going to belabor all this, but the bottom line is Michigan $49 to $108 wind is most abundant when the market is offering only 20 bucks for that electricity, and in fact, wind is often setting the market at below zero. And they can afford to do that because of the amount of subsidies. They can actually pay somebody 15 bucks a megawatt hour to take wind because they'll collect 20 or 30 bucks a megawatt hour from the taxpayer to make them whole. And EIA says the same thing. The duty cycle for intermittent renewable resources, wind and solar, is not operator controlled but dependent on the weather or solar cycle. As a result, their levelized costs are not directly comparable to those for other technologies. Yet our law requires that bogus comparison. And finally, even the draft report on renewable energy concedes comparing the cost of new renewables to other types of new generation should be done with caution. If we want to have an accurate comparison between wind with other generation, we have to add enough fossil fuel to it to make it dispatchable. When you use coal for de facto storage for wind, the cost is $190 to $194 a megawatt hour. Gas, it's $149 to $153. At $149 to $194, both are far more expensive than all current dispatchable generation, including advanced coal with CCS, which MPSC I think values at $133. Here's a better solution than what we propose. If a goal of Michigan energy policy is to reduce coal emissions, the act should be reconstructed in such a fashion that it rewards the technology that brings those emissions reductions to the market in the shortest amount of time and for the lowest cost, and to require empirical measurement of those reductions so that a proper cost-benefit analysis can be performed. No more of this phony comparison between wind and coal. And if we look at these numbers, and I'll just talk about this slide briefly, replacing coal with combined cycle gas eliminates all fine particulates, which is Michigan Environmental Council's biggest concern, and mercury emissions from coal, and avoids 60% of the CO2. Adding wind only avoids an additional 10% CO2 emissions, but increases the cost of electricity by about 50%. Despite $2.5 billion of wind and transmission in Michigan, we have no accurate cost-benefit numbers for our current wind mandate. We don't know how much CO2 or mercury or fine particulates have been reduced in the state of Michigan, nor at what price those units of emission were reduced. And if gas goes high, it turns out nuclear is by far the cheapest solution. You don't have to take my word again. National Academy of Sciences said the reduction in CO2 emissions associated with the wind PTC is very small, amounting to about 1/3% of CO2. And the final line says the fiscal cost per ton of CO2 reduced is high relative to other more efficient approaches. Sixth hurdle, expensive energies. You notice from this chart, which is not in the packet in front of you, you'll see that nations that have high mandates for renewable energy have very high energy prices. Aggressive renewable energy mandates correlate with high retail energy prices, 2.5 to 3.5 times the price of Michigan electricity. Germany and Denmark are battling it out for the highest priced producer.
Is this just residential, or is this taken an aggregate of all the different industrial, commercial?
I didn't perform the calculations to create that chart, but they tried to levelize those things across, because you're correct. In Germany, for instance, the residential people pay far more. Industry is sheltered from those increases. In Denmark, that's not the case. But we can't pass these impacts on electricity prices off lightly. Consider the U.S. Steel industry. They report that they spend $18 billion a year on electricity making steel. A 10% increase in electricity rates adds $1.8 billion in cost to U.S. steel industry alone per year. With 100,000 steel workers in the U.S., that's $18,000 per year per employee no longer available for union wages and benefits. High-price electricity has an impact. My alma mater, University of Michigan, they spend $61 million per year on electricity. A 10% increase in the price of electricity is essentially a tuition increase of $214 per year per student, or they could terminate 143 teaching assistants to make up the difference. The choice is strictly up to them. You see, energy is overhead. Increased electricity costs prevent more people from having affordable education, medical care, home utility bills, social justice, high-wage jobs and union benefits, affordable goods and services of all types. Ratepayers' money can only be spent once. Once spent on energy, it cannot be spent on education, wages, medication, or benefits. Low energy density, this is my last point. We see that wind has a much lower energy density, and I'll give you a concrete example. So let's say we wanted to close Fermi 2. It takes about a square mile of land there, and let's say we wanted to replace that with wind turbines. We would have to fill every square mile in that semicircle from Toledo to Detroit, almost to Ann Arbor, with 2 Vestas V100 turbines to replace the annual average generation of Fermi. But we would still have to build a couple 500 megawatt combined cycle gas plants because the wind still isn't there at times of highest demand. In other words, this is Consumers Energy Lake Winds project. One township worth of this, that's Mr. Schindeldecker's house in the middle. I gave you guys a video of his testimony in Mason County about 4 weeks ago. You can see his home surrounded by turbines. One township worth of turbines like that could be replaced with a single gas-fired simple cycle gas turbine mounted on a semi-trailer slid inside your average dairy barn. It's no comparison. Those big turbines make trivial amounts of electricity, and it takes a hellish amount of property to generate any kind of meaningful generation. By the way, last month the Mason County Planning Commission passed a unanimous resolution declaring Lake Winds project out of compliance with the county's zoning ordinance due to excessive noise, which was predicted to them by the residents with the experts they retained at their own expense. The only means that consumers will have to comply with that ordinance is to reduce their output. It remains to be seen what actually happens. But if they're forced to reduce their output to compliance, they would have to keep them throttled back to about 30%. So likewise, the turbines in Gratiot County, you could replace them with a couple small gas turbines. Same thing in Huron County and in Missaukee County. In fact, CMS Energy's combined cycle plant will produce far more energy at a lower cost while also reducing more emissions than all the wind generation constructed in Michigan since PA 295's adoption. And what about 30% wind? We saw the headline number that the environmentalists rolled out across the state last week with the release of the energy report. It's not possible without massive costs, and I'll explain to you briefly why, and then I'll be done. Assume a generous Michigan wind capacity factor of 30%. Now, first of all, Michigan's measured capacity factor from January 1 to date, extrapolated at the end of the year, is only 25%, according to OEA and EIA. But nonetheless, because wind only produces about 30% of its maximum capacity over a year, and we're trying to reach 30% net generation if we're going to go with that high-level mandate, we would have to build wind generation equal to roughly 100% of our current thermal generating capacity. Our average generating capacity in 2012 was 12,500 megawatts. Michigan would need to build 7,000 1.8 megawatt turbines to generate 30% net from wind. That is 1 turbine per every 5 square miles of the lower peninsula. It would cost us at least $28 billion, not counting transmission and additional flexible capacity, etc. Here's the problem. Because that wind sometimes generates 100% of its capacity, and you've now built enough wind to replace all the existing generating capacity in the state to achieve the 30% average, on those windy days, every last coal, gas, and nuclear plant in the state would have to go to zero. Unfortunately, coal and nuclear can't readily do that. So you would also basically have to replace all those plants with new combined cycle gas plants, which massively increases the cost. So there's a huge technical roadblock to going to 30% wind. We don't possess enough flexible cogeneration to work with that. By the way, $28 billion just through the turbines is enough to replace 5,000 megawatts of our dirtiest coal generation with emissions-free nuclear generation located on existing brownfields and using primarily extant transmission, and $28 billion worth of new combined cycle gas turbines would close most of the coal plants in MISO, nearly eliminating PM 2.5 mercury emissions and slashing CO2 by more than 50% across the entire Midwest. But what about the grid? Some argue that excess wind generation under Michigan wind penetration, high wind penetration scenarios will simply be distributed throughout the grid. But those same proponents are right now arguing for high wind penetrations in every state in MISO. The grid cannot be a magic black box answer for every state at the same time. Conclusions. PA 295 has unconstitutionally mandated in-state generation of renewable energy, thereby illegally preventing typically far cheaper out-of-state prairie states providers of energy from entering our market. Number two, PA 295 has failed to require an accurate cost-benefit analysis of emissions avoided. PA 295 has codified an economically invalid cost comparison between new coal and wind, thereby giving wind promoters an invaluable piece of false propaganda stamped with MPSC's seal of approval. Ratepayers will be better served by comparing the cost of new coal, combined cycle plus wind, and nuclear. 4. PA 295 and its de facto wind mandate has devastated our rural regions with massive industrial wind projects that even the National Academy of Sciences conceives as an expensive and dubious means of avoiding emissions. High percentage renewable mandates correlate with high energy prices. 30 to 40 cents per kilowatt electricity would bring about the economic collapse of Michigan industry. There's little doubt of that. And finally, an already reserved margin-constrained MISO, 30% penetrations renewable energy would add almost zero additional dispatchable capacity and could not be achieved without massive and expensive wind curtailments and or replacement of coal and nuclear baseload plants at an absurd price of $28 billion and far higher. One final question. Again, this is the Lake Winds plant. If wind energy is unable to cost-effectively reduce the externalities of our current generation portfolio or deliver cheaper electricity, why should anyone have to live like this? I'm open for questions.
Representative Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for persistence in coming back third time as a charm, I guess. You talked a little bit about subsidies, and I had had some people in my office recently questioning subsidies. Could you go a little deeper and explain what subsidies are actually involved in the renewable and wind in particular, and how that relates to other energy sources?
Sure. Well, the biggest subsidy to wind is the production tax credit. Production tax credit is about 2.2 or 2.3 cents per kilowatt, 23 bucks a megawatt hour, paid to produce that.
And that comes from?
That's from the federal treasury.
Thank you.
A number of the projects, like the Lake Winds project, however, received what now not in operation anymore, was Section 1603 grants. Under the Obama stimulus package, consumers was handed a check for $76 million from the U.S. Treasury to pay for 30% of the construction cost of the Ludington wind plant. That's not in operation right now. There are other, that kind of production subsidy is not available in any other form of generation. The other, wind has a couple other things, which is accelerated depreciation, et cetera, some more tax-specific things. But it's a tremendous benefit to these companies. I mean, NextEra builds a lot of wind, including in Michigan. With the value of that production tax credit, they have more turbines than anybody in the country. They've paid essentially zero federal income tax for the last 5, 6, 7 years. I mean, wind is a very powerful tool to help our largest utilities and corporations evade their fair share of the tax burden.
And if I may go down one other path. That happens to be in my district, and I know that gentleman quite well. And what he's going through is unbelievably sad. But to get to the point where we're talking about expanding the portfolio and creating all these other windmills across the state, that would probably require some zoning changes at the state level to require local municipalities the places to put all of these windmills. Is that not correct?
To receive that level of penetration, absolutely. I come into this wind argument 4 years ago. I was the vice chairman of the Riga Township Planning Commission, where Exelon and consumers showed up wishing to build a project in my district. And so, yes, it was local control that gave the people the ability to say, no, this is an unreasonably sited project. The same turbines Mr. Schindeldecker lives next to would have been 1,000 feet from our homes. And yet, it turns out they're driving people crazy. Mr. Schindeldecker sleeps in his basement, and they take sleeping pills to go to sleep now. So yes, the only way you could get thousands of wind turbines across the state of Michigan, you would have to seize local control. But we see in Ohio that they have state-level siting, where the state decided they would permit turbines to be as close as 500 and 600 feet from people's homes. It has still not been an open checkbook for wind developers there. The people are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars battling these projects all the way to the Supreme Court. Further, with the abandonment of, with Posner's dicta that the in-state generation requirement that Michigan has is unconstitutional, wind developers are essentially beginning to walk away from Ohio, and I expect it to happen in Michigan as well, because our wind resource is just not competitive. We are marginal states for wind in the first place, and that's what the people are beginning to say out loud in Ohio, as Senator Seitz there introduced a bill to eliminate the in-state mandate. They're all saying, if you do that, wind is done in Ohio. Basically saying the only way we can survive in states like Ohio and Michigan is if the legislature creates and operates an illegal cartel whereby you force ratepayers to build and you force ratepayers to buy this energy from inside state boundaries. Fortunately, Judge Posner recognized that's unconstitutional.
That windmill's about 900 feet from his property line, if I'm not mistaken.
1139.
1139. Do you know what the setback is in Europe and Australia and other places around the world?
Well, they can be far bigger, but what's interesting is the manufacturer of this turbine published safety data for their employees that tells them to remain 1,640 feet away from the turbine in the event of a brake failure. Now, they would have to walk 500 feet past Mr. Schindeldecker's home to reach the employee exclusion zone. But they routinely site these turbines hundreds of feet too close. Our wind turbine projects are essentially seizing non-participating property owners' property to be used as uncompensated nuisance and safety zones. That's not acceptable. What I told the Schindeldeckers is, look, if those 56 turbines in Ludington close down a couple thousand megawatts of coal, we might have to agree that's a reasonable social cost. That we have to make some sacrifices. But the truth is, we're still building new fossil generation in the state of Michigan, despite all this money spent on wind, and wind has never replaced a coal generating plant anywhere in the world.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Farrington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just trying to get some clarification on the Judge Posner's decision. When was that done? And I guess my question is, if he stated that, why aren't there lawsuits stopping this? So
Right.
if you can fill me in a little bit more.
Sure. His pronouncement came out in June. Now, ironically, the state used the in-state generation mandate as a defense. Remember, the state was challenging, I think it was FERC, and saying, look, you're requiring Michigan to pay all these socialized transmission costs for renewable energy across MISO, but Michigan is rolling their own, if you will, inside your own state. We're not going to benefit from that generation because we have an in-state mandate. Therefore, we don't want to pay these socialized transmission costs. The judge says, well, unfortunately, your in-state generation mandate has an insurmountable obstacle, is that it's unconstitutional. Only the federal government can regulate interstate commerce. So we're left in this odd case where we're now forced to pay for all this interstate transmission ordered by FERC, but at the same time our law prevents us from taking advantage of that cheap prairie states wind to fulfill our mandate. Nobody has sued yet. I would expect at some point maybe an out-of-state wind developer would bring suit, but I think that their operations require in-state mandates to be financially viable in a number of states, so they don't have a huge incentive to sue. And my group has appeared in front of the MPSC at a rate case and made our case to the judge there that, look, this is unconstitutional. Consumers' applications should not be approved because it only exists because of an unconstitutional mandate. Frankly, if I had the funds, we would be in court, but despite the rumors, I'm not really funded by the Koch brothers.
Representative Lane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple observations. I don't think that the wind power was to replace coals. I think it was going to be an alternative measure to it. And when I've seen, and I'm not sure who did this map, but when I've seen an overall wind map of the state when they determined whether they were going to go into the thumb area to build their farms, the numbers were much different than this when you look at an overall wind. And while I'll give you, there's certain parts of the state that wind can't be generated, and there's other areas off the water where we can get a much greater. So it's a snapshot in time to what we're talking about as far as wind speeds. And one of the things I just caution is that, again, I don't think it was meant to take out coal plants. But I think to be in the 21st century, I think it's an alternative to the future. And I think we have to be mindful of all the manufacturing plants that have geared up for this now. You pull the plug, you're pulling plugs on jobs and manufacturing. And there is a benefit. I'm not saying an overall benefit, but I think there is still some benefit to it, and I think we are seeing some value. But if we thought we were going to generate power strictly on wind turbines, I think we'd be fooling ourselves. But I think there is a value, and I think we need to be cautious as to the people that have invested in this plan to just pull the plug and think that we're going to shut down shops that have geared up to manufacturing a lot of these turbines. And there's a lot of areas in Canada and those forests that are still doing very, very well at a very low powered amount. Some of it is us getting a very late start at generating what our buyback was going to be. Part of that was based on the states doing.
Well, frankly, I disagree with most of what you said. And we have to figure out what our goalposts are for this energy policy. Do we create energy policy to create jobs? Do we create it to close coal transmission? Do we create it to move into the 21st century? I've heard various groups argue all these various points. My point is the act itself said was to provide affordable and clean energy, and I'm saying it does not apply any kind of meaningful cost-benefit analysis to its own stated criteria. And those investors in the end are you and me. They're not people reaching into their own pockets and building wind turbines. These are people that are essentially strip mining the U.S. tax code to construct wind generation projects. We heard the gentleman testify here 2 weeks ago and say, without these subsidies, my business collapses. Now, I'm sorry, you've built your project on sinking sands. And so, no, I don't think that I would want to continue to tell the Schindeldeckers the reason you have to live in this home is because if we stop these subsidies, those 40 or 50 people at Ventower might be out of work. That doesn't seem like a reasonable trade-off to me.
One last thing, Mr. Chair, and I agree, there is local control. There is flickering. It's very hard to put these turbines in a suburban area. I mean, that's why they're placed, but locals have that for flickering, for icing. I mean, you get those blades going, they ice up, can create quite a bit of damage.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of thought in this, and it isn't to create jobs, but it is an alternative. In order to provide that power, somebody has to manufacture these parts. If we're not doing it in Michigan, they'll be buying them in Canada, they'll be buying them in Europe, they'll be buying them in Germany. So being the manufacturing sector we are, even if we don't sell it to ourselves, we can still sell these, and it is very successful in Iowa and other places. Thanks.
I would say we can still compete for those manufacturing jobs the old-fashioned way by being the lowest cost provider of those commodity parts for wind generation. The fact is, most of the turbines being built across the U.S. are European turbines, and many of the parts are being generated, I would say, largely in the non-union southeast.
Any other questions? With that, I appreciate your testimony.
Thank you.
Appreciate your question.